Today, as we approach the last weekend of basketball's March Madness, I thought it would be appropriate to read from John Feinstein's recent book about Coach Krzyzewski, Coach K, called 5 Banners Inside the Duke Basketball Dynasty. The 5 banners refer to the 5 NCAA championship banners won by Duke during Coach K's time as coach. He was coach from 1982 to 2022, and the 5 banners were won in 1991, 1992, 2001, 2010, and 2015. I'm just going to read the introduction and epilogue from the book, but adding a little more history about John Shire, who succeeded Coach K as the head coach of Duke in 2022. So first, the introduction of the book. It was basketball that first brought me to Duke University 50 years ago. It is basketball that still brings me back. When I visited Duke as a high school senior in February 1973, my dad and I went to see Duke play second-ranked Maryland in Cameron Indoor Stadium. Duke wasn't very good. The team was en route to a 12-win, 14-losses record. But that day, the Duke Blue Devils played superbly. Senior guard Gary Malchione scored 39 points, and Duke pulled the upset. The building rocked with noise, and in the final minutes, the Duke students sang the Amen chorus, which had become Maryland's end-of-game victory song. As we left the building, I turned to my dad, who desperately wanted me to go to Yale. He was an adjunct faculty member there at the time, and said, "Dad, I'm sorry, but if I get in here, I'm going here." I got in. I'm not sure my dad ever completely forgave me. Never, though, did I imagine the ride that Duke basketball would take me on when I made the decision to become a Duke student. 10 days after I arrived as a freshman in the fall of 1973, the men's basketball team had no coach. Bucky Waters, who had already been told his contract would not be renewed until after his fifth season, resigned to become a fundraiser for the Duke Hospital. Athletic director Carl James attempted to hire Adolph Rupp. Yes, Adolph Rupp, the legendary University of Kentucky coach who had been forced into retirement by the school in 1972 because he had made the mistake of turning 70. Rupp had won 4 national championships, the last one in 1958. He had also coached in college basketball's most important and famous game, the 1966 NCAA championship game, when his all-white Kentucky team lost to a Texas Western team that started 5 black players. Books were written and movies were made about that game. Rupp never reached another Final Four. James scheduled a press conference for October 18th, 3 days after the official start of basketball practice, to introduce Rupp. But Rupp's farm director died suddenly, and Rupp told James that he couldn't leave his farm. James instead promoted Neil McGeechee, Waters' #1 assistant, and gave him a 1-year contract. The Blue Devils went 10-16 that season, the worst record in Duke history, and James informed McGeechee that he wouldn't be asked back as coach only minutes after the historic 8 points in 17 seconds loss to North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Somehow Duke, leading by 8 points with those 17 seconds left, at a time when there was no three-point shot, managed to lose in overtime that Saturday afternoon to Dean Smith's vaunted Tar Heels. Bill Foster was hired to rebuild the program. And he did, but it took him 4 years. My last 3 years as an undergrad, while I was covering the team for Duke's student newspaper, The Chronicle, Duke was 40-40 overall and 32 losses in ACC play, including 3 first-round losses in the ACC tournament, meaning my 4-year record was 50-56 and 9-42. When I repeat those numbers to people today, they don't believe me. Duke won more than 30 games 15 times during Mike Krzyzewski's 42 years as coach. From 1984 until Krzyzewski's retirement in 2022, Duke failed to win at least 20 games on only 3 occasions. Duke last in the ACC, people would say to me, "Get real." Back then, it was very real. In 1978, when I was a night police reporter at the Washington Post, Foster turned it around completely. Duke went 27-7, won the ACC tournament for the first time since 1966, and reached the national championship game. I had convinced George Solomon, the sports editor of the Post, to let me cover the Final Four in St. Louis if Duke got that far. As a result, I was sitting in Foster's Friday press conference the day before the Blue Devils were to play Notre Dame in the semifinals. Someone asked him how his team had gone from last in the ACC a year earlier to the Final Four. Foster, who had one of the greatest dry senses of humor I've ever encountered, looked right at me and said, "Well, John Feinstein graduated." Everyone in the massive interview room began looking around, wondering who the hell John Feinstein might be. Only Ken Denlinger, the Washington Post's great sports columnist, who had given me the floor of his hotel room as a place to sleep, had any clue what I looked like. He was the entire list. The real answer to the reporter's question was, of course, that Duke had added 2 superb freshmen, Gene Banks and Kenny Denard, to a lineup that included junior guard Jim Spinacle and sophomore center Mike Jaminski, and that was the reason for the team's remarkable turnaround. Duke beat Notre Dame 90-86 the next afternoon, in those blessed and long days when the Final Four semifinals were played in the afternoon, and finally lost to Kentucky 94-88 in the championship game. The only player who graduated from that team was walk-on guard Bruce Bell, now a judge in Kentucky, but all sorts of off-court issues prevented that group from reaching those heights again, although the 1980 team did reach the Elite Eight after beating Kentucky on Kentucky's home court in the Sweet 16. By then, Foster, feeling unappreciated, had left to become the coach at South Carolina. Athletic director Tom Butters began a search for a successor that landed on an unknown coach named Mike Krzyzewski, who had just finished going 9 wins and 17 losses at Army in his 5th season at his alma mater. It was Steve Vasendak, Butters' newly hired number 2 man, who had brought Krzyzewski to Butters' attention. Vasendak had been a great player for Duke on 2 Final Four teams in the 1960s. While living in Annapolis, Maryland, he had gone to watch a Krzyzewski coached Army game play arch rival Navy. Because my high school coach was friends with Bob Knight, Mike let me hang out with his team all day, Vasendak said. I was blown away. He wasn't yet 30, and yet he sounded to me like a guy who'd been doing it for 20 years when he talked to his players, and his players could really guard, which is why Vasendak brought Krzyzewski up to Butters, who had told him he wanted someone who could really coach defense. Butters had never heard the name. What was his record this season, he asked. It was 9-17, Vasendak said. What? Butters said. Are you trying to get me fired? Vasendak finally talked Butters into giving Krzyzewski an interview. He was impressed enough to give him a second interview, and a third. Still, he couldn't pull the trigger. What are you thinking? Vasendak said after the third interview. I'm thinking he's the next great coach, Butters said, but how can I hire a guy who is just 9-17 at Army? If he's the next great coach, Vasendak answered, how can you not hire him? Butters paused a moment. Then he said, go out to the airport and bring him back. Vasendak found Krzyzewski waiting in line for his flight back to New York. You need to come back, he said. Tom has one more question to ask. What the hell can he possibly ask me, Krzyzewski said. He's interviewed me 3 times. Just trust me, Vasendak said. When Krzyzewski walked into Butters' office again, still steaming, he repeated what he had said to Vasendak. There's one question I haven't asked you, Butters said. What? Will you take the job? Krzyzewski calmed down quickly. What? He said again in an entirely different tone. And then, of course I'll take the job. The rest is history, complicated history, but history nonetheless. So that's the introduction to the book, which goes on to describe the years that led to the 5 NCAA banners that Coach K won in 1991, 92, 2001, 2010, and 2015. So a little bit more about John Shire to begin this section, because I'm going to read the epilogue. John Shire was recruited by Coach K in 2006 from his high school in Northbrook, Illinois, where he had led his team to an Illinois state championship. At Duke, he moved from shooting guard to point guard and was most valuable player of the 2009 ACC Men's Basketball Championship. In his senior year, 2009 to 2010, as Duke's captain, he led the team to ACC regular season lead and tournament championships, as well as the NCAA National Championship, the 4th banner of Coach K's time there. In the final game of the NCAA Championship, Shire scored 5 of the team's last 10 points, 15 points altogether in the game, and led the team with 5 assists. He also, in 2010, graduated from Duke with a BA in history, including taking a course in the history of science with my husband. He did not get drafted by the NBA because first he had mononucleosis that took him out for 3 weeks during the draft process. He then played for an NBA D team, but suffered a serious eye injury that led to permanent visual impairment in that eye. Next, he played 2 years in Israel and then in Spain before coming back to Duke as a special assistant coach in April of 2014, and then co-associate head coach in 2018. He became head coach of Duke in 2022. In the 3 years he has been head coach, his team has won the ACC tournament twice, 2023 and 2025. For the NCAAs, his team made it to the NCAA round of 32 in 2023, the Elite Eight in 2024, and now in 2025 to the Final Four. So now I'm going to finish by reading the epilogue from John Feinstein's book. On the night of November 7, 2022, John Shire walked onto the court at Duke Cameron Indoor Stadium, something he had done hundreds of times since the fall of 2006. The place where I grew up, he said later about Duke's home venue. This time, though, was different. Shire had jogged onto the court as a Duke player for 4 years, and he had walked onto it as a Duke assistant coach and as Mike Krzyzewski's associate head coach for 8 years. Now, though, the entire building awaited his entrance. He was about to become the first person in 42 years to start a season as the new Duke men's head basketball coach. As Shire came onto the floor and walked toward the bench, intentionally taking an indirect route that allowed him to exchange palm slaps with many of the students, the chant began, "We want 6, we want 6. This is 6 NCAA banners they're talking about. Shire was unaware of the chant. He was completely in the moment, savoring the fact that he was now Duke's head coach, successor to the iconic Krzyzewski, while also wondering nervously how his team would play. I didn't hear it, he said, laughing, when the game was over and Duke had beaten Jacksonville University easily, but I can certainly believe it. Part of Krzyzewski's legacy is that he left the Cameron rafters stuffed with banners, 22 ACC tournament championship banners, 15 won by Krzyzewski, 17 Final Four banners, 13 earned by Krzyzewski, and a banner that hangs in the South and commemorating Krzyzewski's record 1,202 victories. But the 5 banners that matter most, the ones that students were chanting to increase to 6, hang at the north end of Cameron. They all say national champions on them, and they were all won by Coach Krzyzewski's teams. Shire is expected to add a 6 at some point in the not too distant future. So much for reasonable expectations. I understood that when I took the job, Shire said. Coach K set an unbelievably high bar, and all I can do is try the best I can to come somewhere close to this. The last of the 5 banners was hung in 2015 after the 8 is Enough national championship in Indianapolis. 3 of the 5 starters from that team, Yahiel Okafor, Justice Winslow, and Tyus Jones, left Duke after 1 season, but only after Krzyzewski insisted that they finish the spring semester academically. I knew they weren't going to graduate, he said, but I didn't want them to leave before they at least finished 1 year. The next 7 seasons didn't produce another national championship. In fact, most of Duke's numbers went down. The overall record of 183-55 would have pleased about 99% of the schools in the country, but an average season of 26 wins and 8 losses was not up to standard, specifically Krzyzewski's standards. After winning the ACC tournament 11 times in 17 seasons, there were only 2 ACC tournament titles, one in 2017 and the other in 2019. After 11 regular season titles, in 20 seasons, there were none for 11 straight seasons beginning in 2010-11. After 12 Final Fours in 30 seasons, there were none for Duke from 2016 to 2021. Duke was good, just not great. The one and dones continue to swirl through the revolving door. Some, like Jason Tatum and Brandon Ingram, going on to NBA stardom, and others like Zion Williamson, having immense talent but carrying a perennially injured asterisk. Duke reached the Elite Eight in 2018, losing in overtime to Kansas after a Grayson Allen jumper that would have won the game went in and out at the buzzer in regulation. A year later, the Blue Devils were stunned by Michigan State in the regional final, losing 68 to 67. That was Duke's so-called super team, led by three one-and-dones, Williamson, Cam Reddish, and R.G. Barrett. The Blue Devils were actually lucky to make the Elite Eight that year. Only a missed follow by Johnny Dawkins' son, Aubrey, allowed them to beat the University of Central Florida, coached by Dawkins, and another missed layup at the buzzer allowed them to escape Virginia Tech in the round of 16. The night before the regional final, I had dinner with Tom Izzo. You can beat him, you're tougher than they are. They think they'll always find a way to win because they're so talented. I think you win tomorrow. In this case, I was right. The Spartans made plays down the stretch and Duke didn't. You were right, Izzo said to me after the game. He smiled and added, for once. That evening was the first time Krzyzewski sounded worn out to me after a loss. He said all the right things, but there was strain in his voice and exhaustion on his face. It was the first time the thought occurred to me that the end was near. It might have come in 2021, but Duke had its worst season since Krzyzewski's lost season in 1991. The Blue Devils were 13-11 and barely hanging on to the NCAA tournament bubble when a positive test for COVID-19 forced them to forfeit their ACC quarterfinal game to a Florida State, ending their season without an NCAA tournament bid for the first time since 1995, not counting the non-tournament season of 2020, when Duke was 25-6 before COVID shut everything down. Krzyzewski didn't want his career to end on such a down note, but he was ready. On June 2nd, 2021, he announced he would retire at the end of the 2022 season and that Shire would succeed him. The other finalist for the job was Harvard coach Tommy Amaker, who was, like Shire, a great Krzyzewski point guard. Many thought it was well past time for Duke to hire a black coach, even though there hadn't been an opening for a head coach at Duke since 1980. Amaker had been hugely successful at Harvard, and unlike Shire, had head coaching experience. Shire had the advantage of having been part of the program for most of the previous 16 years, and also being 22 years younger than Amaker. Many people wondered why Krzyzewski didn't wait until season's end to announce he was retiring. I had to do it for recruiting, he explained. I couldn't go into kids' homes in September and have them say, how much longer are you going to coach, and either lie or tell the truth. I couldn't lie, and the truth would have been public instantly. This way, John had a clear shot at his own recruiting class. So as I say, in the 3 years that Shire has been head coach, his team has won the ACC tournament twice, 2023 and 2023, For the NCAA, his team made it to the NCAA round of 32 in 2023, the Elite Eight in 2024, and now in 2025 to the Final Four. So even with, it is clear that Duke is in good hands with Shire as coach, and national championship banner number 6 is a lofty but not unreasonable expectation. Maybe not this year, but soon. Thank you.